Some days it feels like the whole world is on fire, and we're the adults trying to keep it together. Now imagine what that feels like for a kid. From scary headlines to unsettling events in their schools or neighborhoods, our children are absorbing it all, and it can take a toll. In fact, research shows that kids exposed to community-wide trauma are twice as likely to experience anxiety, depression, and risky behaviors in the months that follow. I'm Jodie Sweetin, and this is Awkward Conversations, where each week we look to arm parents with the tools to raise happy, healthy kids who are empowered to make smart choices about substances. And today we are talking about how parents can guide their kids through shared community trauma, turning moments of uncertainty into lessons in resilience, security, and connection. Because when it comes to your child's well-being, not knowing what to say or do in these moments is the scariest thing of all. So stick with us. It's season 5 of Awkward Conversations. Let's get into it. And Amy McCarthy, senior clinical social worker at Boston Children's Hospital in the Division of Addiction Medicine.
Thanks for having me back. I'm
Absolutely.
looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. It's a really important one. And I am honored to introduce Dr. Roxane Cohen Silver, Vice Provost for Institutional Research, Assessment, and Planning, and a distinguished professor in psychological science, public health, and medicine at the University of California, Irvine. She's an internationally recognized expert on how individuals and communities cope with trauma, stress, and collective crisis. Welcome, Dr. Silver.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yeah.
We're also pleased to welcome back Dr. Stephen Schlozman. Schlozman? Sorry, I'm saying it wrong, I think. Schlozman.
Who's close? Schlozman.
He's the medical director for the Vermont Center for Children, Youth, and Families, and associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Vermont Larner College of Medicine. With experience at Dartmouth and Harvard, Dr. Schlozman brings deep clinical experience and compassion to understanding how children and teens process anxiety, trauma, and uncertainty. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. And this is a heavier topic that we're discussing, and it's something that affects not just our kids, not just the people that we're caregiving for, but ourselves, our communities, our country at large. And would you be able, Dr. Silver, to just define what the different kinds of stressors that we're talking about in collective trauma are?
So when we talk about collective trauma, we're often talking about community-wide disasters. They can be man-made disasters like a school shooting or a mass violence event, terrorism, or they can be natural disasters like wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes. And these are the kinds of events that affect a local community, but then are often widely broadcast beyond the local community, nationally and internationally via the media.
I know that one of the things, that's different for this generation than past generations is that media content used to be filtered. You had to see it on TV. It had to be kind of vetted by, cable news channels or what have you. Now young people have access, and all of us have access to this 24/7 raw video, available on social media or other outlets. How is that potentially impacting young people in this generation and all of us perhaps in new and different ways?
Well, it's very, very different from the way the first event that I studied, the Columbine High School shootings, were portrayed because, as you point out, there used to be one or two ways to communicate these kinds of disasters. It was on television that was heavily edited and monitored by editors, or in print media, or sometimes radio, but mostly people received information by weekly magazines that came. Those kinds of images were static, were often not very graphic. And now, in addition to a 24/7 news cycle, we have unfiltered, unedited content, often extremely graphic, and it's accessible instantaneously, sometimes even through live feed. Some years ago, there was a terrible mass violence event in a mosque in New Zealand, and the perpetrator of this mass violence actually was wearing a camera and was live feeding the tragedy. Back when I started studying this topic, we were particularly interested in the role of the media in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And back then, there were conversations via many news organizations and editors deciding whether or not they should show pictures of people either falling or jumping from the World Trade Center, that kind of conversation is no longer something that anyone is having.
We know from the American Academy of Pediatrics that now young people who are exposed to disasters of some kind are 2.5 times more likely to experience PTSD symptoms. And it sounds like it's no wonder given, what you're describing here.
Absolutely. I mean, 2001, as you were speaking of, when 9/11, I was almost 20 years old, and I can still remember some of the traumatic images that we saw and what that felt like. And now those sorts of traumatic images and movies and clips, we're inundated with them. You can't escape them. And if you see one and you click on it, then your algorithm becomes even more full of it.
It is not only that we can easily see them, but they are far more graphic.
And it's just so permeated our culture. Dr. Steve, do you see that kids react differently depending on the type of event? Or, how do these climate disasters versus, a school shooting incident or mass violence, how do those things affect children in different ways?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can tell you from my experience of working in Boston. So there we can think about the Boston Marathon bombing, things that happen deliberately as opposed to an act of God, as they're sometimes called, at least in insurance manuals. They tend to be associated with greater traumatic response based on the research that I've read and also just based on my experience with kids. Since coming to Vermont, I've only been up here a couple of years, but there's been some pretty scary flooding, like houses falling into rivers, basically, in ways that they hadn't seen in the state before. So the other player here is, if it's a natural disaster, but it's an unusual natural disaster, or it's potentially the new normal, that tends to heighten trauma too. And the other thing I've noticed is the worry about the event actually is worse than the event itself. And so, in other words, the event happens, it's horrible, but then the people who get through it, thankfully, it's on their minds all the time. And certainly, I'm sure it's the case. I've read some of the studies on the wildfires in Los Angeles and also just around the country. But it's scary. So the things that are done deliberately and the things that are unusual, and unhappily, some of these things are more common. Can I tell a brief anecdote here?
Yes, please.
Because this is
yeah.
Okay. So I'm not trying to necessarily lighten the mood. It's a really intense topic, but I remember so maybe 3 years after the World Trade Center horribleness, there was a viral attempt to advertise a cartoon called Aqua Teen Hunger Force.
Yes, I love Aqua Teen Hunger Force. Yeah.
It is a great show,
Yeah,
right?
throwback.
It was across Boston. It was in a number of other cities. They basically had put what were essentially light bright sets under all the bridges.
Yep.
Yeah, you were. I
live in Boston,
then.
yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. And people freaked out, right? This was 9/11's fresh on everyone's mind. We're thinking this is something else. These are bombs under the bridges. The Stroll Drive was closed, the main thoroughfare into Mass General where I was working. And I remember this kid finally came in and he was late and I was really worried. And so I said, "Hey, are you okay? Do you want to talk about this?" And the kid said, "Dude, it's Aqua Teen Hunger Force." I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he said, it's all over the internet. And I'm like, "It is not all over I've been on the internet." And he said, "Where are you looking?" I'm like, "I'm looking at NPR, CNN." Where do old people look?
Right.
And he said, "No, let me show you where." And he brought me to some site and he said, "Look, it's happening in Seattle and
Right.
Portland." And, meanwhile, the FBI had spent, $bazillion dollars in Homeland Security with people in spacesuits out there trying to defuse light bright sets. And no one asked a 12-year-old. My point is that these tools, these internet tools, which are horrible, which bring right to your fingertips the awfulness at graphic levels that we've just talked about, they also, in the hands of the right kids, actually can help them too. And that's something that's really interesting to me.
The powers of social media can be for great things. I've seen really wonderful things. I've seen people come together in times of crisis and, mutual aid and all of that. And then I've seen sort of the worst of it. So we do know that it can be both of those things. And it's really about trying to guide our kids to the more positive ones where they feel like they can make a difference or make a change in something that might feel really scary.
And so, some of these things are a little bit different or new for society to kind of contend with. And so the adults in children's lives are figuring it out as kids are kind of figuring it out. But the anxiety that, is kind of, bolstered by the uncertainty of all of this.
Yeah. I know it affects adults in, PTSD and you feel powerless. What are the difference between how it affects children and adults?
part of what the work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the last 20 years is to show how this kind of repeated exposure to graphic images of violence or disasters can have very negative psychological and actually physical health consequences for adults. So we need to recognize that the parents are also experiencing anxiety.
I find my kids they have phones, so they'll look at the news.
Mm-hmm.
My daughters are 17 and 15, and they'll open and like we were saying, those graphic images and that nonstop news cycle is something that I never had to deal with. I wasn't going to go pick up the newspaper from my parents and start flipping through, but scrolling through the news and seeing all of these images and pictures can be really terrifying for everyone.
The young people that work with me, these are mostly my students. My children are already older now, but my students tell me that what is now happening is that on TikTok, for example, people are preparing little videos with upbeat music, repeating these graphic images. The images are real, but they are then being manipulated in some way with music that makes them sort of fun to watch, which is really, I think, counterproductive to people's psychological well-being.
I think also, you said like your kids have access to scrolling in the news now, also with like push alerts or, the idea of compartmentalization. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm going to sit down and watch TV and now this is coming on, or I'm going to search out the newspaper. It's popping up on your phone. You're, in school or you're taking care of your kids. And like you said, Dr. Silver, like for parents, it's everywhere. One thing that I'm curious about is, does how the community or a parent or caregiver responds to these events like impact the long-term effects on young people?
Well, let me describe some research that my colleagues and I conducted in Chile and in Indonesia after some terrible earthquakes and tsunamis that they had. We found that the ways in which the parents were reacting to these events had a very strong effect on their children. So if a parent is anxious, worried, distracted, ruminating about these kinds of tragedies, they are in general unable to hide that from their children. And these kinds of emotional responses literally spilled over to their children, so that we found that the more anxious the parent, the more anxious the child. The more distracted the parent, the more distracted the child. And so it is extremely important to recognize that we can't protect our children from learning about these events, but we can monitor our own exposures and our own reactions such that we can provide a sense of calm, resilience within the family.
And it's really hard to be a parent in these times. Like because you, on the one hand, you're scared, right? It's your world, it's your house, it's your neighborhood, it's your people who are under some sort of threat right now. Also, you love your kids more than anything. And so you are so worried that something will happen with your kids. And this is the paradox, right? Because the extent to which you sort of bleed that worry to the kids, they pick up on this. I mean, they're wired to pick up on it. Everything in their evolution is to pick up on that. So what kids will maybe show it in different ways. They won't be necessarily anxious about their house falling into the river, if I use a Vermont example, but they'll be anxious about other things. They'll be anxious about getting their work on time. They'll be anxious about being in touch with their friends. So this is where parents actually have to take care of each other. And that's something that that we spend a lot of time on, like, how are you doing to the parents? What are you doing to take care of each other? Are you guys, maybe you can shake off a little bit of the anxiety so that what you can present to your kid based on where they are developmentally, if it's a little kid, you're going to say, it's okay. It's safe. I got your back. Let's play a game right now. If it's an older kid, you're going to say, here are the ways I've got your back. Like here are the things, and here are the things you can do to help your community. Because the worst thing is to have something bad happen to be a kid who's just getting old enough to have agency, right? To do things and to say there's nothing you can do. That's a terrible feeling. Terrible around climate, terrible on everything. So you say, here are ways you can volunteer. And communities tend to be pretty good about that, about finding ways to bring communities together. Because one thing we know, and this is not my field, this is more Dr. Silver's field, but I was reading these studies earlier today, the tighter a community is pre-event, the better the community at least appears to do. This seems kind of obvious, but seems to do after the event. It's not a given, but if a community is functional, feels good about itself, takes care of itself, people watch each other in that way. All the things that we like for communities, and those communities tend to make their way through these events much better. One way you do that is you share your anxiety with your husband, wife, partner, friends, neighbors, and then you can spare your kids that experience. But also, I don't want parents to beat themselves up too much if they show some of that, because it's a really scary time. And you can always say to your kid, hey, I'm sorry, I was really worked up. It is scary, but I got this. So some sort of reassurance where they feel safe and held.
And I think, modeling that behavior of resiliency, like Dr. Silver was talking about, is key. And, we talk about resiliency all the time. That's the number one factor that, is a huge key for success in life, is being able to bounce back, and that resiliency that parents can show that, maybe we did lose our house. Maybe our school is gone. Maybe our community is gone, but let's find a way to connect and be in community with each other still.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's really very important that we recognize that there are a number of things that parents can be doing to protect themselves from these kinds of this kind of bad news all the time. As we saw during the pandemic, there was no shortage of bad news, and we could, and there was actually a phrase that was coined by, I think, some journalists during the pandemic, doom scrolling, where people click on one bad story and then another bad story and another bad story. And you could get caught up in terrible news for hours on end. That is not a very healthy way for adults to react to the constant tragedy. There's something happening terrible in the world, probably during the time that we're taping this. And so there's no shortage of bad news. And it's extremely important that parents recognize that they need to protect themselves psychologically and emotionally from this kind of exposure.
Welcome back to Awkward Conversations, and welcome to Season 5. You're listening to Awkward Conversations. Thanks for being here. Now, I know we've been talking sort of in general about, our children and young people and communities, but developmentally, how do children versus teens versus young adults and even adults, what are the ways that they process things differently? Where are they at developmentally to understand some of these things going on around them?
One of my favorite questions. The great thing and the challenging thing about being a clinician who takes care of kids, of little kids, and all kids really, is that developmental trajectory is so steep. The difference between 11 and 13 and 16, it's way different. They have this concrete way of thinking. There's good guys and there's bad guys. So when it's a little kid, what do they care about? They care about being safe. They care about having food, getting their mac and cheese, and that you're going to be there and things will be okay. Even if they're not going to be absolutely okay, am I going to get mac and cheese tonight? How close is this thing we're seeing on TV? Is it my backyard, or is it on the other side of the world? And what does it mean to be on the other side of the world? And you just got to you can even take out a globe and say, we're here and it's here. Like, assuming they understand a globe. As they get older, you can say, these are complicated times. I don't know why this happened. Maybe it was climate change. Maybe, I don't know, but that's not even the point here. The point here is that we're okay. We've got this place to stay for right now. We have this food. You sort of let them know that they can do their inventory. They can make sure that things are okay, because that's what allows a teenager to go back to being a teenager. Your main goal is to allow them to be a kid around that age. And it's not a mystery what a kid that age is like. We see it in TV shows and movies all the time. And I like TV and movies, so it's easy to point to those.
After 9/11, a child might see a plane hit the building, let's say the World Trade Center, or see the World Trade Center fall. And each time it was portrayed, each time these images were repeated, children thought that many, many buildings were falling, on and on and on and on. Older children, they recognize that this is the same image over and over again. So the exposure can be the same, but can be interpreted very differently by different developmental stages.
Yeah, so being able to attend to that and recognize that if for a younger child, you might have to explain, this is the same thing we already talked about. Like, it's not happening again.
But it feels so, like we were talking about, that immediacy, and that you're inundated constantly now with it. And, I have really been making an effort, particularly the last, 6-7 months, the world has felt very disrupted. And I have made an effort for myself to put my phone down, and it's amazing the change in, like you were saying, my anxiety levels. I will now notice I pick up my phone and I'm scrolling through for 15 minutes and my heart's racing and I feel awful and I feel powerless and I feel scared. And I'm like, it's this, but really trying to model that behavior and reading on the couch. My girls will bring a book out and come read, like just trying to, do what we can to all regulate our nervous systems.
And I think that's something we usually refer to as like compartmentalization. So like, this is maybe time. You can't always control when it's going to happen, but I'm going to create space around, I can engage with this or I can't. Right. And or it's not the time. I'm choosing not to do this right now. And I think being able to create those boundaries is really important.
Yeah,
for
as a
families.
parent, it's super important.
I also feel like, something I hear a lot of people talk about these days is feeling like there are more tragedies or horrible things happening in the world. And I think about other generations, that, my grandparents living through World War, II, or different things like that.
It's true. It's not like this is the first generation of young people to go through terrible things, but the media landscape is so different than it ever has.
Right.
Things are really different now. Like in a way that's sometimes hard to get your mind around. And sometimes a kid will tell me, I saw something, online, and once we sort of vet it and figure out whether it's okay to see, I want to see this. I have no idea what you're even talking. I can't even begin to picture it. And so that world, it's another reason we need to actually involve younger folks in how we manage these things, because they know the world in a way that I just don't. I can read about it, but I'm not experiencing it. I do think, one more thing I just want to say really quickly, living in Vermont, which is different than Boston, it's, you move up here because of the woods and the hills, and it's gorgeous. People do spend more time outside. People are on their phones less. And so I wonder, and I haven't looked at this to study this, but it's worth thinking about regionally how that differs, where, in certain areas of the country where
access to outdoor space, parks, like all of that.
Lack of cell phone service.
That
plays a role.
Yeah, one of the ways we dealt with the flooding, we got passes from the state of Vermont to the state parks, and we would just give them to people.
Yeah.
We would say that once the park's open, get back out there.
Yeah.
Because we don't want that to be a scary place. We want that to be a cool place.
Did you know in California that you can get a free national parks pass to all of the national parks in the state if you just go in and say, I have anxiety, I have depression? They will give you that because it's been so proven that time outdoors can actually help. So I love that idea. Like, here, go outside, touch some grass.
Are there
what I did want to touch on, though, sort of in relation to the children and teens issue, is how do we balance out the idea of being honest and truthful with our kids and minimizing things, because I think sometimes as parents, especially with littler kids, we want to go, no, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Rather than maybe have some of the more difficult, harder conversations, because it's easier to just push it aside, and minimize it than to actually say, okay, here's some scary things and here's where we go.
It's a neat question. It's my kids are 5 years apart, so they're at different developmental stages, and probably like all of our kids, those of us who have kids, they're quite different temperamentally. So my older one is very, very intense. My younger one would run around naked with a bucket on her. So our approaches, both developmentally, had to be different, but also really importantly, temperamentally had to be different. Like my wife and I had to sort of figure out what would work best for this kid. So anything that either of us say here is going to be like a general statement, and then you'll make exceptions based on your kids. Generally speaking, with the kids, if they're scared, you're going to ask them what they're scared about, because as we just learned, they might be thinking that these buildings are falling down one after another after another. It's not the same building, on the same clip over and over again. So we're going to ask them, tell us exactly what's scaring you right now. And if they say, it's that you're so scared, Mommy, you can say, well, I am scared. Like it'd be dumb to lie. You say, yeah, it was scary, but I've read it. I think it's safe for us to be here right now. And that's why we're staying right here. And now let's, tell me, does that make you feel better? Whereas with an older kid, as they get older, you can start asking them what they think about it. Are they angry about it? Because kids, that's a fairly quick place to go, especially when your brain isn't as developed as adults. And you get mad. Like, who are you to take away my high school day? I was supposed to go on a date and now I have to deal with a flood? It makes me angry. So then you can sort of try to get them back into being angry about just not being able to go on that date. Like that's returning kids to where they need to be developmentally as is appropriate for the way they were before the event. You can't do it perfectly, but that's the goal. And you can even share that with the older kids. That's what I want to happen here. And like, well, that's stupid. This is terrible. What's happening right? Like, no, I understand that, but we can't fix it right this minute. And right this minute, I want you to be a kid. So let's try what to do there.
One thing that's really important, as Dr. Steve is describing, is the importance of communicating with your child about these kinds of tragedies. I remember after 9/11, many different school districts, and actually even preschools, were trying to figure out how much they should talk about terrorism with children. And there were many parents who said, well, I don't want this to come up at all, which was sort of naive, because even if the parent tried to protect children from finding out about this tragedy, somebody in the playground was going to mention it. And so I think it's extremely important that we are honest with our children, that these kinds of events happen, and everything that Dr. Steve was just describing as a clinician about how to respond to these kinds of tragedies, I think was right on target. And I think what is not useful is for parents to think that they can protect their children from learning about these kinds of tragedies. It's just ubiquitous. There's just no way to avoid it. And so I think it's really important that parents recognize that they need to have open communication about these kinds of tragedies.
And would you say that it's in doing that also, probably this applies to older kids a little bit, but saying that you're scared too, and that sometimes life is scary, and modeling that behavior, but does that make kids more afraid? It's that hard thing of like, do I not tell them that I'm afraid, or do I say that I am? And then,
Well, let me speak as a non-clinician, and then we'll let the clinician respond. But when 9/11 happened, I had a son who was 9, and my daughter was 8 years older than that. And I, at the dinner table, was crying. I was crying. I mean, the tragedy was so intense for me on the night of 9/11 that I couldn't keep my emotions in check. And I think it would have been inappropriate for me to try to do so. But it would be a mistake for me to say, oh, well, this doesn't bother me at all. Now, let me ask the clinician, do you agree with my assessment?
I mean, kids have first of all, I don't know about your kids, but my kids can detect it when I'm just not being honest about it. If I'm bothered, they can tell, right? I mean, I'll do my best. And I think this is what we would advise parents to do too. Do our best to sort of run it through some sort of filter, maybe by talking about it, right? Going for a walk, whatever it takes to regain your center. But it would make sense to be upset after 9/11. And part of what a parent does is model the things that make sense at a given time. I think what matters a lot, we're in this era right now. We've been talking a lot about media, but maybe one of the effects of I can't tell if it's a chicken or an egg with the media, but the extreme, like the polls, the ways that we like to scream and yell and get outraged. I don't think that's so good for kids and their development. In fact, I know it's not. And you chuckle because it's like, it doesn't feel good. And so given that it's not just that these stories are being reported, but these stories are usually being reported with some sort of finger pointing. It's someone's fault. Someone didn't do their job. They didn't do it right. We want that. I think parents have to balance we have to complicate their thinking a little bit, even for the little kids, in a way that's developmentally appropriate. But say, this is a hard time. We don't know exactly whose fault this is, and that's not even our concern right now. Our concern is keeping you and me and mom and dad, whatever, kids, our dog, safe. That's really what matters.
I think, we've touched on a couple things here that we've touched on throughout the podcast. One is, again, communicating with your child, being able to listen and provide a space to help them kind of help you understand where they're coming from, but also, again, modeling this behavior. And part of that is being able to, say, I am scared or I am having a hard time. But like you said, Dr. Steve, containing those emotions to the extent that you can so that they don't go so big, that the child is as impacted, and being able to then provide that reassurance again that like, we're okay, we're going to get through this, we're going to, work together through this, it is the best approach.
Yeah. There have been many times that my kids have seen something on the news or I've seen something and it, like, Dr. Silver was talking about, really affected me and I cried. And, there have been times, especially as they got older, they'd sit there next to me and cry with me and say this, sometimes the world is a really painful place and really scary, but I got you. I'm here next to you and we can feel this together. But with some of those feelings, I know that there are warning signs to really take a look at when our kids are struggling with the anxiety, depression, PTSD because of some of these things. What are the things to look out for in our kids that might be reasons for concern or reasons to maybe step up our support or intervention?
So there's the biggies: sleep, appetite. Biggies meaning like those are the things you can't miss, right? Like if your child, especially if they're younger and they're having a really hard time sleeping, again, you have to change this based on where they are developmentally. So biologically, developmentally, teenagers like to stay up late and they like to sleep later, and that's because they do consolidation at night and they're sort of thinking about all the events as their brain is growing. So we have to make allowances for that. But changes in what had been present before the event, whatever event we're talking about, whatever community traumatic event we had, isolation, pulling away from friends, pulling away from things that were previously enjoyable. It's what they call anhedonia. It just means lack of hedonism, basically not enjoying oneself. Those are things where you're going to want to step in as best you can. One of the hardest things about this for parents is when you see these things in kids often, when you comment on it, kids will sometimes hear that as a kind of criticism of them. And it's not. You're not angry at them. You're worried. But remember, this is the way kids' brains work. And so you have to sort of temper that. And it would be really good to take them to see somebody at that point. Their pediatrician, the school counselor, coach, clergy, doesn't matter, whoever works for you in that circumstance, so you can get another view of it. Because remember, based on the events we've talking about, the parents are raw also. So you need to have somebody as a little bit of distance.
Well, thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. I know that there is so much in the world right now that families and parents and teens and young people are dealing with collectively, individually, and getting some ideas on how to really support our young people best through scary times like this, through community trauma, has been so wonderful. I'd like to give you one last chance to let people know anywhere that they can find you, any websites or books you might have or information that you might want to share with our listeners and our viewers, and we will make sure and put all of those resources in the show notes for you.
I'm in the psychology department at the University of California, Irvine. I have a website under my name, Roxane Cohen Silver, and it has pages of both media, articles, webinars, podcasts that I've participated in that address many of this content.
That's great. We'll put that information in the show notes so you can catch that. And Dr. Steve, how about you?
So I'm at the University of Vermont, where I'm the chief of child psychiatry here. You're certainly welcome to come up. Nobody comes to Vermont, but I would love to have somebody visit. It's a lovely, amazing place. If you Google University of Vermont, you can find me there. It's also important to note that I have this side career as a writer, and I've written like horror novels, and one of them is a climate, kind of an apocalyptic horror novel that did well. It's still doing well. So there might be a kind of irony that I wrote this story, but I think art is how we deal with these things, even though it's hardly high art, this thing I wrote. But one of the ways we deal with this is we watch The Walking Dead. We watch these shows that help us sort of get our mind around that. And then you just judiciously apply it based on where people are developmentally.
What's the name, Dr. Steve?
Yeah, promise not to laugh. Is called The Zombie Autopsies.
Okay.
And George Romero optioned it, so it was my 5 minutes of fame.
Awesome.
We wrote the screenplay. It hadn't been made yet. It's been optioned 5 times. Maybe someday I'll make it someday.
That's great.
I wish zombies were all we had to worry about.
Right, I know.
That's why they're attractive, right?
Exactly.
Zombies
exactly.
I can deal with. They're not
Yeah.
It's like snails. It's not a problem.
Exactly. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. As we said, all of the links mentioned will be in the show notes for our viewers and our listeners. So make sure that you go check those out. And in the meantime, let's make sure and keep those awkward conversations happening. And we will see you next time. That's it for today's episode of Awkward Conversations. I'm Jodie Sweetin. I'll see you next time. LGBTQ plus youth are almost 5 times as likely to attempt suicide and are significantly more likely to struggle with substance use. In this episode, we will discuss how you can support your LGBTQ child.
It's not their transness that increases their risk. It's their bumping up against society that is transphobic and homophobic that then increases their risk. Who can you talk to? Because what I don't want the parents to do is share their feelings of unease with their child. Let's not invalidate this child's experience, and that's the first thing that I think is really important.
That sense of community is what makes the child feel safe.
It's the empathy of children who aren't maybe in the LGBTQ community that we really need to also emphasize, because the issue is the isolation, the loneliness, the bullying.
They internalize that inside and they use substances for relief and they use substances to cope.
How other people dress is not consent for you to say something or to comment. How other people look does not give you consent to comment on them or bully them. It's like, it's about the sovereignty of who you are as a person.
Make sure to check out getsmartaboutdrugs.com. Parents, caregivers, you can find so many resources of great information there about how to talk to your kids and make these conversations a little less awkward. A huge thank you to the ELPS DAP, which is the largest all-volunteer nationwide drug awareness program, and also a huge thanks to the DEA for their outreach program and for making this possible.
The views, information, or opinions expressed during the Awkward Conversation series are solely those of the individuals, speakers, commentators, experts, and/or hosts involved, and do not necessarily reflect nor represent those of the production, associates, or broadcaster, or any of its employees. Production is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the series available for viewing. The primary purpose of this series is to educate and inform. This series does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. This series is available for private, non-commercial use only. The production, broadcaster, or its channel cannot be held accountable for all or any views expressed during this program.
Make sure to check out getsmartaboutdrugs.com. Parents, caregivers, you can find so many resources of great information there about how to talk to your kids and make these conversations a little less awkward. A huge thank you to the ELPS DAP, which is the largest all-volunteer nationwide drug awareness program, and also a huge thanks to the DEA for their outreach program and for making this possible.
The views, information, or opinions expressed during the Awkward Conversation series are solely those of the individuals, speakers, commentators, experts, and/or hosts involved, and do not necessarily reflect nor represent those of the production, associates, or broadcaster, or any of its employees. Production is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the series available for viewing. The primary purpose of this series is to educate and inform. This series does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. This series is available for private, non-commercial use only. The production, broadcaster, or its channel cannot be held accountable for all or any views expressed during this program.